Hi everyone, this is part 2 of the lecture to accompany chapter 1 in your textbook. Please read chapter 1. There's a lot of information, explanations, and examples that I don't have time to address in this lecture. Okay, let's continue. Cognitive biases are unconscious features of the way our brains work that affect how we reach conclusions and form beliefs. We may not be completely crazy, but none of us are entirely rational all the time. These unconscious biases interfere with our ability to see things as they truly are. They can cause an emotional reaction based on a stereotype or cause us to get distracted by the wrong thing. The conclusions that we come to are often not grounded in logic or objective evidence. So here's an example of something called the belief bias. Here's an argument. All pit bulls are dogs. Some dogs bite. Therefore, some pit bulls bite. The conclusion of this argument is therefore some pit bulls bite. Here's a hint. If you see the word therefore, what comes after it is probably the conclusion. So, does this argument make sense to you? You probably think so. And why is that? It's because the conclusion is obviously true. We're all pretty sure that at least some pit bulls bite. And both premises are about dogs and pit bulls, so it looks logical. But it's actually illogical. Its structure is incorrect. If it were organized logically, the argument would read, all pit bulls are dogs, some pit bulls bite, therefore some dogs bite. Now, this might not make sense to you right now, first because we haven't looked at argument structure yet, but also because you're still thinking, yeah, but some pit bulls do bite. Sure. But that doesn't make this argument structurally correct. And that's what belief bias is, evaluating the entire argument by the believability of its conclusion. And the conclusion might not even be true. So you might just believe a conclusion, and if you think it sounds true, then you might buy into the whole argument no matter how poorly formed it is. Another bias that is similar to belief bias is called confirmation bias. This is our tendency to pay far more attention and give more weight to evidence that supports what we already believe to be true. As an example, if you're a Democrat, you might embrace evidence that Fox News is biased, but fail to acknowledge any bias that might exist in other news sources like CNN or the Washington Post. On the other hand, if you're a Republican, you might view the same evidence about Fox News as weak and unconvincing, or maybe even ignore it, but pay far more attention to claims that CNN and the Washington Post are, quote-unquote, fake news. We tend to search for and embrace evidence that seems to prove what we already think is true, because we really want to be on the right side of an issue. We want to believe that we are already correct. But a good critical thinker is equally willing to look at and rationally weigh evidence that supports the other side. Is this difficult? Yes. Is it necessary? It is if you want to make good, rational decisions. Some of our cognitive biases are based on heuristics, which are general rules we unconsciously follow when we're weighing probabilities. For instance, if you tend to think a lot about something happening, you might believe that thing is more likely to happen, whether or not statistics bear you out on that belief. So if you hear about a couple of plane crashes, you might start to worry about getting on a plane because it might crash, even though the chances of that happening are somewhere around 11 million to 1 against. You're 100 times more likely to be killed driving a car than riding in an airplane. But are you afraid to get in a car and drive? No. That's because our brains aren't very good at figuring out probabilities. And that can lead to the false consensus effect, where we assume that the opinions held by us and the people around us are shared by society at large. I see this on social media all the time. We tend to have mostly friends who agree with us on social and political issues, and we see those as the right opinions to have, and think that society in general feels the same way, and that anyone who doesn't is somehow a deviant from the norm. So the example here, people who voted for insert name of politician you hate must be crazy, demented, or evil, and that's how we feel. Then there's the bandwagon effect, which is our tendency to align our beliefs with the beliefs of those around us. In fact, We might think something's the case, but then when we realize other people around us are thinking differently about it, we might begin to actually think like they do. Lots of marketing and ad campaigns revolve around the idea that lots of people buy a particular product and you should too. So you buy a certain brand of jeans because your friend won't wear anything else. It's a popular brand and you want to look as cool as your friend and the other people who wear them. Again, these are all cognitive biases that are unconscious in our minds. We are also guilty of the negativity bias, which is the tendency to give more weight to negative information than to positive information. That's actually a survival mechanism. Positive information won't generally hurt us, but negative information might. Why do you think that news reports are much more focused on bad news than good news? We pay more attention to bad news. We give it more weight, and because of that, we're more willing to sit through commercials so that we won't miss any of the bad news. So we're likely to believe things like a nasty rumor that we hear, or assume that a law being passed will cause more harm than good. That's the way our brains work. Sure, good news is nice, but it can't hold a candle to bad news in our brains. It's also easier to form negative opinions of people who don't belong to the groups that we belong to. By groups, I'm referring to things like our nationality, our culture, our religion, our ethnicity, our social class, or anything like that. Ingroup bias is also a survival mechanism. Early humans bonded together in groups to survive, but tended to compete with other groups for resources like land, water, and food. So in order to survive and thrive, your group had to believe it was better than the other groups. And groups tend to stereotype outsiders in order to keep their own groups cohesive. But what might seem like a good thing can actually lead to some pretty bad decisions and even worse actions. If we believe that all members of another group have similar negative characteristics, then we also might think that any ideas those outsiders have are negative as well. And while we tend to think that our own successes and the successes of members of our group are certainly due to hard work and good character, we tend not to think the same thing about successful members of outgroups. Let me give you an example. I was listening to a radio podcast about the discrimination faced by Black people who are high-income earners. A Black man and his wife who together earned about $200,000 a year in perfectly legitimate ways. He was a businessman and she was a marriage and family therapist. But they moved into a beautiful house in a gated community, and their neighbors were very standoffish. They couldn't figure out why, but finally one of them asked the man if he was a rapper. And then they even admitted that they'd heard rumors that people thought that they were drug dealers, because how could they possibly have made so much money otherwise? It's pretty bad to think so poorly of someone, but unfortunately, it's very common. The fundamental attribution error is closely related to the in-group bias. This error is very common. We attribute reasons for our own behavior or the behavior of people in our groups very differently from people we don't know or those that we see that are not like us. The experience of the Black couple I just talked about is an example of this. But it can happen if we don't know someone or don't like someone. Let's say you're driving down the street and the car in front of you is swerving dangerously. Your immediate thought is probably that that person is drunk, or maybe they're texting and driving, both things that are not good. So you're attributing either of those things to that driver's carelessness and disregard for the law and the safety of others. So your automatic conclusion about that driver is that they're a jerk and they shouldn't be on the road. But what if none of that is true? Maybe a wasp flew in an open window and the driver was trying to maintain control of the car while avoiding getting stung while looking for a place to pull over. That reason is not dependent on any negative characteristics that the driver might possess. One potentially destructive bias that we have is obedience to authority. Now, generally speaking, it's a good thing in society that there are people in charge of things, and we expect those people to have the knowledge and experience to be able to be in charge and to direct other people to do things. However, humans have a troubling tendency to obey someone in authority, even against their own better judgment. There have been many experiments to prove this, most famously the Stanley Milgram experiment in the 1960s. Look it up. It's very disconcerting to realize that perfectly ordinary people could be persuaded to give deadly electric shocks to other people. You might be thinking, oh, I'd never do that. But can you be sure? Many of our cognitive biases are based on self-deception. We like to think, and maybe even we need to think, that we're good, better, or maybe the best at whatever we do. One of these biases is the overconfidence effect. We often tend to overestimate our ability to do something. We simply think we are better than we actually are. The book uses the example of American Idol, where hundreds of people line up to audition, and every single one of them thinks they're going to beat the odds and make it, only to be told that they really aren't that good. Kind of a letdown. Similarly, the better than average illusion causes us to overestimate our abilities when compared to other people. I'll bet you think you're a pretty good driver, don't you? You're at least better than the average driver, right? Well, guess what? 70 to 80% of people rate themselves as better than the average driver. But think about that. How can 80% of people be better than average? Only 50% of people can be better than average. So 30% of those people who think they're better than average are wrong. But even when you point that out to people, most of them insist that they are not in that 30% and that they are indeed better than average. One of the objectives of learning critical thinking for you may be to prove that what you've thought is true all along is actually true. But when you realize that you've come to lots of conclusions throughout your life that were based on cognitive biases, it can be disillusioning. Here's the thing. You can come to the truth, but it's not easy. Critical thinking is not easy. It's not natural. All those biases are natural. Critical thinking takes work. Let's remember the difference between objective and subjective claims. Objective claims are those that are either true or false in the normal common sense way. With enough good verifiable evidence and observations, we can assert a claim's truth with an argument and generally prove it to be correct, and we can know that it is correct. However, some objective claims do not have enough evidence as of yet to be able to prove that they are true, but the potential exists that they can be proven to be either true or false. So the objective claim life exists on other planets can't be proven either true or false yet because we simply don't have enough evidence either way. But the potential exists that we will be able to prove this claim true or false. Subjective claims are variable. They might be true to one person but not to another. Because there is variability to people's tastes and to what they value, there is no way to prove these claims are true in the same sense that we can prove an objective claim to be true. So there's never going to be a list of the 50 greatest movies of the 20th century that everyone is going to agree on, and no way to prove that indeed those movies are the best. In conclusion, I want you to see that critical thinking involves looking very carefully at your own reasoning process, as well as the way others come to conclusions. Critical thinking can be waylaid by emotion, confirmation bias, and other human frailties. But if you persist, it can help you to spot bad reasoning in your own arguments, as well as in the arguments of others. This is the end of the lecture on Chapter 1.